She knew details about my life that no stranger could possibly know, and when I saw the 80-year-old photograph, I understood why. The alarm clock screamed at exactly 7:30 a.m., just like every other Tuesday morning. David rolled over and hit the snooze button with practiced precision, his eyes still heavy with sleep. 3 more minutes of peace before the real world demanded his attention. Outside his small apartment window, the city was already stirring to life with the distant hum of traffic and the occasional car horn. By 8:15, David was shuffling around his tiny kitchen, making the same breakfast he'd eaten for the past 6 months. 2 slices of toast, a cup of black coffee, and whatever fruit was about to go bad in his refrigerator. Today it was a slightly soft apple that he ate while checking his phone for any urgent client messages. Nothing that couldn't wait until he got to the cafe. David had been freelancing as a graphic designer for 3 years now, ever since he'd quit his soul-crushing corporate job. The freedom was nice, but some days the loneliness crept in like fog rolling off the ocean. Working from home meant he could go days without having a real conversation with another human being. That's why he'd started going to Cafe Luna twice a week. It gave him somewhere to be around people, even if he didn't talk to them. The walk to the cafe took exactly 12 minutes if he kept his usual pace. David knew this because he'd timed it obsessively during his first few weeks of going there. He was the kind of person who found comfort in routines and patterns. They made the world feel manageable, predictable, less likely to throw him any surprises he wasn't prepared for. Cafe Luna sat on the corner of 5th and Maple, squeezed between a used bookstore and a dry cleaner. It wasn't the fanciest coffee shop in the neighborhood. The floors creaked, the paint was chipped in places, and the bathroom door stuck. But it had character. More importantly, it had his table. The corner booth by the big window had become David's unofficial office. He'd claimed it by accident on his first visit when everywhere else was full, but now he couldn't imagine sitting anywhere else. From that spot, he could watch the street life unfold while working on his laptop. The morning light was perfect for his computer screen, and the old wooden table had just the right amount of wear to make it feel comfortable. When David pushed through the glass door at exactly 9:47 a.m., the familiar smell of coffee beans and fresh pastries wrapped around him like a warm blanket. The morning rush was starting to thin out, leaving behind the usual crowd of regulars he'd come to recognize over the months. There was Mrs. Chen, who always ordered a green tea and sat by herself reading romance novels with embarrassingly shirtless men on the covers. She'd give David a polite nod when their eyes met, but they'd never exchanged more than pleasantries about the weather. In the opposite corner sat the college kid who David privately called Philosophy Boy because he was always hunched over thick textbooks with titles about existence and meaning. The kid looked permanently stressed, like he was carrying the weight of all human knowledge on his narrow shoulders. Behind the counter, Lisa was working the morning shift. She was probably the closest thing David had to a friend at the cafe, mainly because she actually knew his order by heart and would start making his coffee the moment she saw him walk in. She was young, maybe 22, with purple streaks in her brown hair that changed color every few weeks. Today the streaks were blue. "Morning, David," Lisa called out, already reaching for his usual cup. "Medium dark roast, 1 sugar coming right up." "Thanks, Lisa." "How's the art class going?" David asked, settling into his booth and pulling out his laptop. Lisa was taking night classes at the community college, studying to be an art teacher. "Professor's making us paint fruit again," she said, rolling her eyes. "I swear if I have to paint one more apple, I'm going to lose it. I mean, how many ways can you paint an apple, you know?" David smiled and nodded sympathetically, though he privately thought that mastering the basics wasn't such a bad thing. His own art had improved dramatically once he'd stopped trying to be creative and focused on getting the fundamentals right. The coffee arrived in his favorite mug, a thick, cream-colored ceramic cup that retained heat better than the paper cups most customers got. It was one of those small perks that made him feel like he belonged somewhere, even if that somewhere was just a coffee shop table. David opened his laptop and pulled up his current project. The local bookstore, Pages and Dreams, had hired him to redesign their logo and business cards. The owner, an elderly gentleman named Mr. Rodriguez, wanted something that felt both classic and modern, whatever that meant. David had been wrestling with the design for 2 weeks, creating version after version that never quite captured what his client was looking for. As he worked, the familiar sounds of the cafe created a comfortable background soundtrack. The espresso machine hissed and gurgled. Conversations blended into an indistinct murmur. Chairs scraped against the wooden floor as people came and went. It was like working inside a gentle storm of human activity. Around 10:30, the morning crowd thinned out significantly. The business people had hurried off to their offices, the early commuters had caught their trains, and the cafe settled into its mid-morning quiet period. This was David's favorite time, peaceful enough to concentrate but with enough ambient noise to keep him from feeling isolated. He was deep in thought, adjusting the kerning on some text, when something made him look up. Maybe it was the way the conversation seemed to pause, or how the usual background noise shifted slightly. Whatever it was, David glanced toward the door just as the little bell above it chimed. At exactly 10:47 a.m. on what had started as a perfectly ordinary Tuesday, everything in David's predictable, comfortable world was about to change forever. The door chimed, and David looked up from his laptop screen without really thinking about it. He'd heard that sound hundreds of times before during his visits to Cafe Luna. It was just another customer coming in for their morning coffee fix. Nothing special, nothing out of the ordinary. But then he saw her. She stepped through the doorway like she was walking onto a movie set. Everything about her seemed to catch the light. Her auburn hair that fell in soft waves around her shoulders, the way her vintage leather jacket fit perfectly over a simple white summer dress, even the confident way she moved. David found himself staring, which wasn't like him at all. He was usually the guy who minded his own business, kept his head down, observed from a distance. The woman paused just inside the door, not rushing like most people did when they entered a coffee shop. Instead, she took her time looking around, the cafe with curious eyes. David noticed she wasn't checking her phone or fumbling for her wallet like everyone else. She seemed completely present, completely aware of everything around her. Other people in the cafe noticed her too. David watched as conversations slowed down and heads turned in her direction. Mrs. Chen looked up from her romance novel, Philosophy. Boy actually closed his textbook, and even Lisa behind the counter straightened up and smoothed down her apron. It wasn't that the woman was showing off or demanding attention. She just had this natural magnetism that drew people's eyes like a magnet. The woman's gaze moved slowly around the room. She looked at the businessman in his expensive suit who was typing furiously on his laptop near the window. Her eyes passed over the group of college students who were sharing a plate of muffins and probably gossiping about their professors. She glanced at the elderly man in the corner who came in every day to read his newspaper from front to back. David expected her to walk toward the counter to place her order, like any normal customer would do. Instead, she kept scanning the room, her eyes moving with purpose like she was looking for something specific, or someone specific. Then her eyes found his. The moment their gazes met, David felt something strange happen in his chest. It was like his heart skipped a beat, then started beating too fast to make up for the missed one. The woman's expression changed too. Her casual curiosity transformed into something else entirely. Recognition? Relief? David couldn't tell, but whatever it was made his stomach flip in a way that had nothing to do with the coffee he'd been drinking. A smile spread across her face. Not the polite, distant smile you give to strangers, but something warmer, deeper. The kind of smile that suggested shared secrets and inside jokes between old friends. It was the smile you'd give someone you'd been waiting to see for a long time. David's rational mind started working overtime. Did he know her from somewhere? Had they met at a client meeting he'd forgotten about? Maybe she was a friend of a friend from college. He searched his memory, trying to place her face, but came up empty. He would have remembered her. He was absolutely certain about that. While David was lost in his thoughts, the woman started walking. Not toward the counter, not toward an empty table, but directly toward him. She moved with complete confidence, weaving between the other tables like she knew exactly where she was going. Her eyes never left his face. David's hand started to shake slightly. He set down his coffee cup before he could spill it all over his laptop. His mouth felt dry, and he couldn't figure out if he should say something or wait for her to speak first. Part of him wondered if he should pretend to be busy with his work, but he couldn't look away from her approaching figure. The other customers in the cafe seemed to sense that something unusual was happening. Conversations became quieter, and David caught a few people glancing in his direction with curious expressions. Even Lisa was watching from behind the counter, her eyebrows raised in surprise. The woman reached his table and stopped. For a moment, they just looked at each other in silence. Up close, David could see that her eyes were a warm brown color with tiny flecks of gold that caught the morning light. She had a small scar above her left eyebrow and laugh lines around her eyes that suggested she smiled often. Without asking permission, without even hesitating, she slid into the booth across from him. The movement was so natural, so casual, that, for a split second, David almost believed this was normal. Almost believed that this beautiful stranger had every right to sit at his table like they'd arranged to meet there. "You're exactly where I thought you'd be," she said, and her voice was like music. There was something about her accent that David couldn't quite place. Maybe Italian, maybe Spanish, but soft and warm like honey. David stared at her, his brain struggling to process what was happening. The logical part of his mind was screaming that this was impossible, that normal life didn't work this way. Strangers didn't walk into coffee shops and act like they knew you. Beautiful women didn't smile at ordinary guys like him and sit down uninvited at their tables. But there she was, sitting across from him like it was the most natural thing in the world. Her presence filled the small booth, making everything else in the cafe seem distant and unimportant. Even the familiar sounds of the espresso machine and morning conversations faded into background noise. David realized he needed to say something, anything, but his throat felt tight and his usual words seemed to have abandoned him completely. David's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. He couldn't form words, couldn't think of anything intelligent to say. His brain felt like it had been unplugged and plugged back in. But the connection wasn't quite working right. The woman sitting across from him waited patiently, that knowing smile still playing on her lips. "I'm sorry," David finally managed to croak out, his voice rougher than he'd intended. "But I think you might have me confused with someone else." The woman tilted her head slightly, studying his face with those warm brown eyes. She didn't look confused or embarrassed like someone who had just made a mistake would. Instead, she looked amused, like David had just told a joke that only she understood. "Do I?" she asked, and there was something playful in her tone. "David Martinez, 28 years old, freelance graphic designer. You live in the apartment complex on Oak Street, the one with the blue mailboxes. You drive a silver Honda that has a small dent in the back bumper from when you backed into a fire hydrant last winter." David's blood turned to ice water in his veins. The fire hydrant incident had happened in a grocery store parking lot at night, and he'd been too embarrassed to tell anyone about it. He'd paid for the repairs out of his own pocket and never even filed an insurance claim. "How do you know that?" he whispered, his voice barely audible over the cafe's background noise. But the woman wasn't finished. She leaned forward slightly, her voice taking on a softer, more intimate tone. "You come to this cafe every Tuesday and Thursday morning. You always order the same thing, a medium dark roast with 1 sugar, no cream. You always sit in this exact booth because you like watching the street through the window, and because the lighting is perfect for your laptop screen." David's hands were trembling now. He gripped the edge of the table to steady himself. Everything she was saying was true, but these weren't things a stranger could know. Even Lisa, who he'd been talking to for months, didn't know half of these details about his life. "You're working on a logo redesign for Pages and Dreams bookstore," the woman continued, glancing at his laptop screen. "Mr. Rodriguez wants something that feels both classic and modern, but you're struggling because those two concepts seem to contradict each other. You've created 14 different versions so far, and you're not happy with any of them." That detail hit David like a physical blow. He'd never told anyone about how many versions he'd created. He'd never even counted them himself until yesterday evening when he'd gone through his files in frustration. "Stop," David said, his voice shaking. "Just stop. How do you know all this? Who are you?" The woman reached across the table and placed her hand gently over his. Her skin was warm and soft, and David felt a strange tingling sensation where she touched him. It wasn't unpleasant, quite the opposite, but it was unlike anything he'd ever experienced. "There's more," she said quietly, her eyes never leaving his face. "You have a small scar on your left hand right here." She touched a spot on his hand where, indeed, a tiny white scar marked his skin. "You got it when you were 12 years old, trying to fix your mother's paper shredder because you wanted to surprise her. You ended up cutting yourself on a sharp piece of metal instead." David yanked his hand back like he'd been burned. The scar was barely visible, just a thin white line that most people never noticed. He'd gotten it exactly the way she described in his childhood home on a Saturday afternoon when his mother was at work. He'd wanted to be helpful, to show her that he was responsible and capable. Instead, he'd ended up needing 3 stitches and a lecture about not touching things he didn't understand. "This isn't possible," David said, his voice rising slightly. A few people at nearby tables glanced in their direction, but he didn't care. "You can't know these things. Nobody knows these things." The woman sat back in her seat, her expression becoming more serious. "I know it's hard to believe, David. I know this doesn't make sense according to everything you understand about how the world works. But sometimes the world is bigger and stranger than we think it is." David's mind raced through possibilities. Was she some kind of private investigator? Had someone hired her to research him for some reason? But why would anyone care about his daily routine or childhood accidents? He wasn't important enough to spy on. He was just a freelance graphic designer who lived alone and spent most of his time working on other people's marketing materials. "Are you following me?" he asked, though even as he said it, he knew it didn't make sense. Following someone might explain knowing his routine but not the intimate details about his past. "Not in the way you're thinking," she replied. "David, I know this is overwhelming. I know you have questions and you deserve answers, but I need you to trust me for just a little while longer." Trust her? David almost laughed, but there was nothing funny about the situation. How could he trust someone who somehow knew details about his life that even his closest friends didn't know? How could he trust someone who appeared out of nowhere and acted like they had some kind of history together? But even as his logical mind rebelled against everything that was happening, David found himself studying her face. There was something about her expression, earnest, gentle, almost vulnerable, that didn't match the image of someone with sinister motives. She looked like someone who was trying to help him understand something important, not someone who meant him harm. "I have to go," she said suddenly, glancing at a vintage watch on her wrist. The watch looked old, like something from decades ago, with an intricate silver band and a face that had yellowed slightly with age. "But I'll be back tomorrow morning, same time. I promise I'll explain everything then." She started to slide out of the booth, then paused and reached into her jacket pocket. She pulled out a small package wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. It looked like something from another era, when people took time to wrap gifts properly instead of just shoving them in gift bags. "This is for you," she said, placing the package on the table between them. "Don't open it until tonight, after the sun goes down. Promise me." Before David could respond, before he could ask any of the 100 questions crowding his mind, she was gone. She slipped out of the booth and walked toward the door with the same confident grace she'd entered with. David watched her go, his mind still reeling from their impossible conversation. The package sat on the table like a small bomb, innocent-looking but somehow threatening at the same time. David sat in his apartment that evening, staring at the brown paper package like it might explode at any moment. He'd carried it home from the cafe in his backpack, feeling its weight with every step. It wasn't heavy, probably just a few ounces. But it felt like it contained the answers to questions he didn't even know how to ask. The sun had set an hour ago, painting his small living room in shades of orange and purple through the single window. He'd turned on the overhead light, but the package still seemed to cast its own shadow on his coffee table. The woman's words echoed in his mind. Don't open it until tonight, after the sun goes down. David had spent the entire afternoon trying to focus on work, but his concentration was shot. He'd stared at the bookstore logo for 3 hours without making a single useful change. Every few minutes, his eyes would drift to his backpack where the package was hidden, and his mind would spiral back to the impossible conversation at the cafe. Who was she? How did she know so much about his life? And why did looking at her feel like remembering something he'd forgotten a long time ago? His hands shook slightly as he picked up the package. The brown paper was old and soft, like it had been wrapped years ago instead of hours ago. The string was real twine, not the synthetic stuff they used in stores nowadays. Even the way it was tied looked old-fashioned, with careful loops and knots that someone had taken time to make perfect. David untied the string slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. The paper fell away to reveal a small silver picture frame, the kind that might sit on someone's nightstand or mantel. Inside the frame was a black and white photograph that looked like it had been taken decades ago. The photo showed a young couple, standing together in what looked like a garden or park. The man was wearing a military uniform, the kind David had seen in old World War II movies. He was tall and dark-haired, with a confident smile and eyes that seemed familiar. The woman beside him was breathtakingly beautiful, wearing a flowing white dress that caught the light like it was made of silk. Her hair was styled in the waves that were popular in the 1940s, and she was looking up at the man with absolute adoration. David's blood turned cold as he studied the woman's face more closely. It was her. The woman from the cafe, not someone who looked like her, not a relative or a coincidence. It was exactly her, unchanged by what should have been 80 years. His hands trembling, David flipped the frame over. On the back, written in elegant handwriting that looked faded with age, were the words, "James and Elena, 1943. Some souls are meant to find each other across lifetimes." David dropped the frame like it had burned him. It landed on the coffee table with a soft thud, the photograph face up, the couple smiling at him from across the decades. James. The name hit him like a physical blow. His great-grandfather's name had been James Martinez. David rushed to his bedroom and pulled out the old shoebox he kept under his bed. Inside were family documents his mother had given him years ago. Birth certificates, old letters, faded photographs. His hands shook as he searched through them, looking for the pictures he remembered seeing but had never paid much attention to. There it was. A photograph of his great-grandfather in military uniform, taken sometime during World War II. David held it up next to the framed photo and his heart nearly stopped. It was the same man, the same face, the same smile, the same eyes that David saw in the mirror every morning. But that was impossible. His great-grandfather had died in the war in 1944, just a few months before David's grandfather was born. David's grandmother had raised her son alone, and she'd rarely talked about her first husband. David knew almost nothing about him except his name and the fact that he'd been a soldier. David grabbed his laptop and started searching. James Martinez World War II brought up thousands of results, but he narrowed it down by adding his great-grandmother's maiden name and the year. After an hour of digging through military records and newspaper archives, he found what he was looking for. Sergeant James Martinez, killed in action in Italy, 1944. Survived by his wife, Elena Rossi Martinez, who had emigrated from Italy the year before their marriage. But here's where it got strange. Elena had disappeared shortly after receiving news of her husband's death. The newspaper article mentioned that neighbors had been concerned when she stopped answering her door, but when authorities checked her apartment, she was simply gone. No trace, no forwarding address, no family to contact. It was like she had vanished into thin air. David kept searching, looking for any mention of Elena Rossi in the decades that followed. Nothing. No death certificate, no remarriage records, no trace of her existence beyond 1944. According to official records, she had simply stopped existing. But David had seen her that morning, had talked to her, touched her hand, watched her smile. She was real, solid, warm. She wasn't a ghost or a hallucination. She was a flesh and blood woman who somehow looked exactly the same as she had 80 years ago. As the hours passed and David dove deeper into his research, more pieces of his own life started to make terrible sense. His inexplicable comfort with Italian phrases even though he'd never studied the language. The dreams he'd been having for years about a woman with dark hair calling his name. The feeling he'd always had of waiting for something, someone, without knowing what. Most disturbing of all was the growing certainty in his chest that he'd seen Elena's face before, not in photographs or dreams, but in some deeper way that his rational mind couldn't accept. David barely slept that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Elena's face from the photograph, then from the cafe, then from dreams he was only now beginning to remember. By the time his alarm went off, he felt like he'd been awake for days. But he was dressed and walking toward Cafe Luna by 9:30, a full hour earlier than usual. He needed answers, and he had a feeling Elena would give them to him. The cafe was busier than normal for a Wednesday morning, filled with people David didn't recognize. He claimed his usual booth anyway, ordering his coffee from Lisa, who seemed surprised to see him on a different day. "You okay?" she asked, studying his face with concern. "You look like you didn't sleep." "I'm fine," David lied, accepting his coffee with hands that still trembled slightly. "Just had a weird night." Lisa nodded sympathetically and went back to work, leaving David alone with his thoughts and the photograph he'd brought with him. He'd stared at it so many times that he'd memorized every detail. The way James's hand rested on Elena's waist, the expression of pure happiness on both their faces, the way the light caught Elena's dress. At exactly 10:47, the door chimed. Elena entered with the same confident grace as the day before, but today David was watching for different things. The way she moved, the way she held herself, the small details that had seemed charming yesterday but now felt significant. Her dress was different, a soft blue color instead of white, but the vintage style was the same. So was the leather jacket and the old watch on her wrist. She walked directly to his table without looking around the cafe, sliding into the booth across from him like she'd done it 1,000 times before. "You opened it," she said, noticing the photograph on the table between them. It wasn't a question. "You're Elena Rossi," David said, his voice steadier than he felt. "You married my great-grandfather in 1943. Elena's smile was sad and beautiful. "I married James Martinez in 1943. He was the love of my life, my soulmate, my everything. And when he died 6 months later, I thought my world had ended." David leaned forward, studying her face. "But that was 80 years ago. You should be dead. You should have aged, changed, lived a whole life. Instead, you look exactly the same as you did in this photograph." "Because I made a choice," Elena said quietly, her fingers tracing patterns on the table. "When the telegram came telling me James had been killed, I couldn't accept it. I couldn't believe that love like ours could just end because of something as simple as death." David waited, not trusting himself to speak. The logical part of his mind was screaming that this was impossible, but the deeper part of him, the part that had been having dreams about Elena for years, was listening to every word. "I was raised by my grandmother in Italy," Elena continued. "She was what people would call a wise woman, though others had less kind names for her. She taught me that love, real love, doesn't follow the same rules as everything else. That souls who belong together will find each other again and again, across lifetimes, across impossible distances." Elena looked up, meeting David's eyes with an intensity that made the rest of the cafe fade away. "So I made a choice to wait, to stay here in this world, until James came back to me, until his soul found its way back into a new life." "You're saying I'm him," David said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're saying I'm James reborn. I'm saying you're the soul I've been waiting for, the one I've loved for longer than most people live. I've spent 80 years moving from city to city, following feelings and intuition, searching for the moment when you would return to me." David felt something shift in his chest, like a door opening that had been locked his entire life. "The dreams I've been having, The feeling that I was waiting for something. The way I felt when I first saw you. Your soul remembers mine, Elena said softly. Not your mind, not your conscious memory, but something deeper. Something that death can't touch. David picked up the photograph, looking at James's face again. The resemblance was undeniable. They could have been twins separated by decades. But it was more than just physical similarity. There was something in James's expression, a way of holding himself that David recognized from his own reflection. How? David asked. How is any of this possible? Elena reached across the table and took his hand. The moment their skin touched, David felt that same electric sensation as the day before, but stronger now. It was like coming home after a long journey, like finding something he'd lost years ago. Love doesn't follow the rules of time and space that everything else does, Elena said. When two souls truly belong together, when their connection goes beyond this single lifetime, they find ways to stay connected. I chose to wait for you because losing you once was more than I could bear. I couldn't lose you forever. David looked into her eyes and saw love there. Not the quick attraction of strangers, but the deep, abiding love of someone who had known him longer than he'd been alive. It was overwhelming and impossible and absolutely real. So what happens now? David asked, his voice rough with emotion. Elena's smile lit up her entire face. Now we get to fall in love all over again. Now we get to have the life that was stolen from us 80 years ago. Now we get to keep each other. As David sat there, holding Elena's hand and looking into eyes that had loved him across decades, he realized that some stories don't end with death. Some love stories are so strong that they bend the rules of reality itself. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, you get a second chance at forever. Outside the cafe window, the world continued its ordinary rhythm, unaware that two souls had just found their way back to each other across the impossible distance of time itself.